My name is Lindsay Smith. I am presenting some of the content in our session on focused portfolios today, and we'll be joined by others who will contribute to answer some of your questions that may come up during the presentation. We're going to be saving all of our questions to the end. So if you have a question during the presentation, you can type it into the Q&A box on the bottom, and then when that question is recorded, someone will click on a little button and it says it's answered. What that means is we've captured it in a separate area, and then we will come back and answer all of the questions at the end of the presentation so that they're all captured in the recording and that others can hear the responses to the questions that may be helpful for them too. So we will dive in now, next slide, looking at how to apply for funding as a focused portfolio. What we're going to be covering today is, in general, how to prepare to apply for funding. And then specifically, we will look at the tailored for transition and tailored for focused application approaches. And then we'll talk a little bit about the pilot of the CCM investment priorities application approach. We'll highlight some of the resources that are available to you, some immediate next steps, and then we'll spend most of our time in the question and answer. We've often found that there are lots of questions that come up during these presentations that are helpful to clarify for everyone, and we'll do that all at the end. So if you do have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box that's on the bottom of your screen, and then we will record those to answer at the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's dive into the topic for today, preparing to apply for funding. The first part of preparing to apply for funding is understanding that the environment that we are currently working in has fundamentally changed. Grant Cycle 8, which is the grant cycle we are entering with the Global Fund, is going to look substantively different than Grant Cycle 7 was, or Grant Cycle 6 before that. The Global Fund has been introducing this concept of strategic shifts. And strategic shifts that are documented on this screen are really important for all of us to understand because they're affecting everything that we should be thinking about for the type of grants that will be developed for Grant Cycle 8. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these strategic shifts because there was an excellent presentation by the head of our strategy department who was able to have that recorded last week. It's available on the Global Fund website. I would encourage everyone to take the time to listen to the presentation on strategic shifts that Julia Martin was able to share with us. Just as a very top line, things that you need to be thinking about already are about the reality of having predictable transition timings, the importance of rigorous prioritization in selecting where we are investing, what the role is of integration in your specific portfolio as we think about health overall and service delivery, the significance of developing community health systems with sustainable financing, and where those domestic resources and co-financing are going to be building up as pillars to make sure that that sustainability is going to be continued after Global Fund financing is no longer available. So next slide, please. One of the most visible shifts that you would have seen in your allocation letter is the communication of transition timing, which has now been shared with the portfolios and the components that are going to be receiving a final allocation in Grant Cycle 8, or they have been notified that they may receive their final allocation in Grant Cycle 9. There are also some portfolios, even within the focused portfolios, that do not have a defined transition timing, but it's important that all Global Fund portfolios are anticipating that there will be a need to transition from Global Fund financing in the future. And it's important that all portfolios start preparing for this transition and thinking through how they can ensure the sustainability of the appropriate program priorities to effectively fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria in the future. Next slide. In the funding requests and in the funding applications that are being developed for Grant Cycle 8, you have already been informed about the application approach that you should be thinking of using for this Grant Cycle 8 submission. The application approach we will go through in just a moment, but we've already highlighted are the tailored for transition, tailored for focused, or the CCM investment priorities route. That application approach has defined criteria or requirements, what is expected to be submitted, and the new terminology that we're introducing with Grant Cycle 8 are submission pathways, and that will help you understand how they should be developed and the specific roles of the CCM and the principal recipient in developing these funding applications. We're going to be going through both of these concepts in this information session today. Next slide. The application approaches that are relevant for focused portfolios are the following ones. The Tailored for Transition application approach is for the focused portfolios that have at least one component that has been identified as GC8 being the final allocation. We'll go through the requirements for this and what needs to be submitted as part of the funding request package. This will go through a TRP review. The Tailored for Focused are a limited number of focused portfolios that they do not have a GC8 transition timing, but still have been identified to develop a funding request and to go through that TRP review to help optimize that execution. These first two buckets, the Tailored for Transition funding request and the Tailored for Focused funding request, make up the majority of the focused portfolios funding application approaches for Grant Cycle 8. In total, there are 29 portfolios that have been requested to develop the Tailored for Transition application, and there are 4 portfolios that have been requested to develop the Tailored for Focused funding request. There are additionally 10 portfolios, which is about a quarter of our focused portfolios, that have been identified to pilot the CCM investment priorities route. And we'll talk more about that a bit later in the presentation. Next slide. For the applicants that have been requested to develop the Tailored for Transition or Tailored for Focused funding request, they will have a choice of 2 different submission pathways. Those funding requests are fundamentally, they have the same requirements, except for the performance framework and the budget, which if a CCM has an ongoing principal recipient that they plan to nominate for Grant Cycle 8, and they would like that principal recipient to develop the grant level performance framework and budget, they can choose the grant ready funding request pathway. And that means that the CCM would develop the majority of the application, the majority of the funding request with all the other annexes, and they would ask the PR to complete the performance framework and budget for their specific grant. Alternatively, a CCM, if they have a new principal recipient, for example, or if they have an existing principal recipient but choose to use the classic funding request pathway, can develop the full funding request package themselves, including the funding request level, performance framework, and budget. Those are the 2 different submission pathways that a CCM can choose if they have been identified for using the Tailored for Transition or Tailored for Focused funding request application approach. Next slide, please. If you are developing a funding request in 2026, because, for example, your grants are ending at the end of this year and you'll need to start your new implementation period in January 27, you'll need to be aware of the submission windows. These funding request packages will need to be developed and submitted in one of 3 submission windows in 2026. The dates of those are the 8th of June, the 27th of July, or the 5th of October. And if you have a grant that's ending at the end of 2026, you really need to aim for window 1 or window 2 in order to have sufficient time to complete your grant making and submit your grant documents to be ready for implementation start at the beginning of 2027. Next slide. A change for Grant Cycle 8 is that our funding requests will be shared with the applicants, with the CCMs, and also submitted to the Global Fund through the partner portal. This is a platform that has been used by the Global Fund already with principal recipients and local fund agents in previous funding cycles and continues to be developed. We are now expanding the access to our country coordinating mechanisms as well. So CCMs, our applicants in general, will be able to receive their documents and submit their documents through the partner portal for Grant Cycle 8. Next slide. Now, to have access to the partner portal, it's really essential that the grant entity data, GED, is accurate and up to date. We have already taken the step earlier in 2026 of auto-loading our CCM admin focal points into the grant entity data for the funding request module in the partner portal and given them submitter rights for the funding request module. Now, this partner portal interface is not yet active. That will probably be active in the next week or so. And at that point, we would certainly encourage that it's an important step that the admin focal point then updates the 1 or 2 submitters that will be submitting the funding request. Those should be a CCM member, or alternatively adds a couple of CCM members or technical assistance providers or consultants as editors, if necessary, who are able to then download the documents, work on the documents, share the documents offline. That can be done by email, and then reattach the documents when they're ready for submission. Those are different roles in the partner portal, and it's the CCM admin focal point that has the responsibility of making sure that they correctly identify the names and the email addresses for these specific roles. Next slide. In order to be able to have the funding request created and the documents shared in the partner portal, the CCM will need to make some decisions, some operational decisions, and they'll need to do that quite quickly if they want to come to window 1 or submit their documents even in window 2. It's important that the CCM identifies for the Global Fund, and we have a form that you can fill out called the Submission Pathway and PR Nomination Form. It's important that the CCM identifies which components will be included in the funding request. For example, if you have both HIV and TB, are they coming in the same funding request, or are they coming in separate funding requests in the same window? The CCM is also asked to confirm the submission pathway, whether or not they choose to use the grant ready funding request, where they've nominated their principal recipient and asked the principal recipient to complete the performance framework and budget, or whether or not they choose the classic funding request submission, where they do the performance framework and budget at the funding request level. They need to identify their nominated principal recipient if they want to use that grant ready route. And they need to confirm which window selection that they will be coming to. Is it window 1 or 2 already in 2026, or a subsequent future window in 2027 if they have their funding request that's not needed to be developed this year? After that process, the Global Fund will be able to then create the funding request in the system and share the documents in the partner portal. If a principal recipient has been nominated, then they also have the ability to then update their grant entity data to be able to then access the grant making module in the partner portal to be able to complete those performance framework and budget documents at the grant level. Next step. Next slide, please. So now we're going to finish on the operational side and think more about the strategic side of some of the key areas that the CCM should be thinking about and planning for discussions on quickly if they are going to be coming to window 1 or 2, or in the future if they are going to be preparing their funding request in 2027 or 2028. One of those areas for deliberation and serious discussion are around implementation arrangements. And you notice that in our strategic shifts, for example, we have highlighted the importance of integrations. Streamlining implementation arrangements can certainly help with that. But streamlining implementation arrangements is also an important step for efficiency and value for money considerations, as well as sustainability in the future. So in all cases, as the CCM considers their choice of implementation arrangements. Not only just is it one PR or more PRs, but also thinking down to the SR level. It's important to identify these key implementers early to make sure that they are able to contribute to the funding request and grant making development, and also so that we improve our opportunity to be more implementation ready by the time that the grant actually starts. Next slide. Another area that the CCM needs to be engaging in on the strategic level is that country dialogue, which is a key important step in the development of the funding application and also through grant making and implementation. The country dialogue that happens at the stage of the funding request development really should consider the inputs from the allocation letter in the aims of the allocation section, as well as the opportunity to optimize what has worked well or didn't work well in the previous grant cycle. It's important that country dialogue is not a start from scratch, let's everybody put on the table everything they want. Country dialogue in this context where we need to be increasingly selective about prioritizing our investments and making each dollar stretch further needs to be very targeted and very focused. So that dialogue really is about ensuring that we are optimizing from what we already know and not starting from scratch, as we may have done in previous cycles. It's important to also acknowledge that CCM eligibility requirements 1 and 2 are still a standard expectation for all CCMs in Grant Cycle 8. So even if you have a CCM investment priorities approach, or you have a grant that you are really clear on your priorities already, it's still very important to make sure that there is an inclusive dialogue to hear from all the different stakeholders that are involved in that global fund in-country engagement, how the grants can be optimized to ensure that we're really investing in the most important and essential priorities and ensuring that that execution is done in the most effective way. The outputs of this country dialogue will be to align on the prioritization of where the investment should go, and then fundamentally delivering that funding application. Next slide, please. A final strategic area that the CCM is really taking the lead on at this stage is then the confirmation or the revision of the program split. In the allocation letter, the Global Fund is communicating to the applicant the indicative split between the different disease components that have received an allocation. It is the responsibility of the CCM in discussions within the CCM to then decide on whether or not they agree with that indicative split or whether or not they propose a change and would propose to move some funding from one disease component to another disease component. If a focused portfolio CCM has only one component, they are not required to make a decision on program split because there is no need to move funds. If, however, your CCM has been given an allocation for 2 or more disease components, then you need to decide whether or not you confirm or would request a change to that program split. If you confirm the program split as communicated to you by the Global Fund, you do not need to complete the form. You can just inform your CT counterpart that you accept the program split as is. If you require a change to the program split, that would need to be documented and justified in the program split change form, and that needs to be submitted to the Global Fund. And any request for change would need to be agreed before the submission of the funding request itself. Okay, now we're going to go into the section on the actual application approaches themselves, and we're going to look at some of the details on what the requirements are. For both of these application packages that are a funding request, both the tailored for transition and the tailored for focused, I want to reassure you that we've done a significant effort to streamline as much as possible. We have 10 fewer annexes than we have in previous cycles, significantly fewer pages in the forms, fewer questions, less dense instructions. And so both of these funding request applications can be developed with either the classic or the grant-ready submission pathway, but the actual application forms themselves are exactly the same, regardless of whether or not you choose the classic or the grant-ready submission pathway. Next slide. This grant ready pathway, just to be sure that we're clear on the steps, is that the CCM makes the choice to nominate an existing PR if they want to go with the grant ready funding request pathway. And then they indicate to the Global Fund that this is their choice. The Global Fund shares the documents, the CCM develops the funding request, that form that I just showed you. We're going to talk about the questions for that in just a moment. And then the PR is going to be developing the grant level performance framework and budget. These are developed, the performance framework online in the grant making partner portal module and the budget offline. The PR then submits these to the CCM, and the CCM reviews them and makes sure they're consistent with the rest of the funding request application. And then the CCM submits that whole package to the Global Fund, which then goes through TRP review. Next slide. For the classic funding request, the CCM confirms that they want to use the classic route, the classic submission pathway. The Global Fund shares the documents, the CCM develops the whole package more autonomously, and then develops the performance framework and budget at the level of the whole funding request. They then submit the application, the TRP reviews, and then after the TRP review and recommendation, grant making then officially starts. Next slide. One consideration that's important that we should be aware of on a going basis is that for our focused portfolios, there are 3 different management models. This has also been shared in your allocation letter, which management model will be used for Grant Cycle 8. And in all cases, focused portfolios are managed so that we require less information from focused portfolios than we do from our high impact and core portfolios. And yet we still have that further distinction, differentiation, according to the context of the country and the status of the program and the grant in that country. And we've identified for the aligned management model to just have a very few programmatic areas with very limited documentation for that. And you'll hear more about that as we get into the details of what's required to be submitted for the funding request package. The targeted model is primarily using a payments for results approach. And then the light model is an input-based, using the modules and interventions in the performance framework as normal, but with fewer than the high impact and core portfolios would. If you have questions on this, we can answer those during the question and answer section. I'm going to pass over to my colleague, David, now, who's going to take us through some of the details of the application forms.
Hi all, my name is David Nash Mendez. Thank you, Lindsay. We'll now walk us all through the application forms for focused portfolios for Grant Cycle 8. The forms have 3 sections: funding request and rationale, domestic financing, co-financing and transition, and implementation. And you'll note that there is no country context section, and that is because the Global Fund is not asking for it. We were really deliberate in designing the forms, as Lindsay mentioned, to only ask for the information that is needed for the reviews. So even though you're used to providing this context in the application form, please check to see what is actually requested for Grant Cycle 8 and only provide that. This will be a theme, so please take notice as we go through this section. Let's go to the next slide. But before we start on the questions in the forms itself, a quick refresher on the instructions. For Grant Cycle 8, the instructions are embedded with the grants application form, with the funding request application form, which is available on the funding request website. So the instructions and the questions are right next to each other. The approach to the instructions will be familiar to anyone who developed a funding request in Grant Cycle 7. Each question in the form points to instruction elements that define a complete answer. Pay attention to the details column on the right, as it clarifies what needs to be covered, and use this structure to avoid gaps and duplication. And again, if we're not asking for it in that details section, chances are we don't need it, so you don't need to include it. Let's go to that next slide. Section 1 of the forms is on the funding request and rationale. The section explains which priorities were chosen and how these priorities will maximize impact. Applicants will present prioritization and matching funds if applicable. Next slide. For question 1.1a, applicants are asked to show how the priorities in their funding request align with the priorities identified and communicated to applicants before funding request development began, as Lindsay mentioned. Generally, these priorities will be included in the allocation letter, but this can be shared in other official documents as well, especially if a funding request is expected in 2027. A full response to the first half of this question is only needed if the funding request is not aligned with those priorities, those focus areas. Otherwise, applicants could just say that the funding requests are aligned with the programmatic focus specified, and then they can move on to the second half of the question. Now, the second half asks about the implementation modalities. These align with the management models, which Lindsay just mentioned. Input-based models requests are used by aligned or light models. Payment for results can be used as a model, and a combination of both input-based and payment for results is used by countries using a targeted model. And regardless of which implementation modality is used, applicants should explain why the modality makes the most sense for that program. Let's go to the next slide. So for Grant Cycle 8, focused applicants are again asked to use the prioritization tables. These look different than Grant Cycle 7. They look different than for Core High Impact, but these are the tables which are used to request financing from the Global Fund. And the way this table is filled out will depend slightly on implementation modality, as well as the management model, which we mentioned. So it's really important to carefully follow both the budgeting guidelines and the performance framework development guidelines before starting on this section. And these resources will be shared soon. So there's quite a few boxes in here, so we're going to go step by step. Let's hit next. Great. So for red, this is one table per module. So if you have 5 modules included in your funding request, you should expect to have 5 tables. And this is if you're using that input-based approach. Next, we have the blue box. Yep. This is the amount requested. And it's important to make sure that this is aligned with the budget. And again, please follow the budgeting guidelines to make sure that this is set up correctly. Next, in the yellow box, this is the implementation modality. This section is for the applicants where the module is input-based, whether it uses payment for results or a mixture of both. And this should align with the approach that was discussed in question 1.1a. Next, if the module includes any input-based investments, the section in green should be included, and it should have a list of interventions included in the module with a 1 to 2 sentence summary of all of the activities. So if your module, for example, has 3 interventions, you should just have a list of 3 interventions with 1 to 2 sentences each, around 6 sentences total. So you don't need more detail than that for the activities at that intervention level. After this, you should show how all of the investments in that module help to maximize impact, especially if part of this speaks to the programmatic focus areas described in question 1.1a. Next, we have the orange box. And this is just for disbursement linked indicators, or DLIs for short, if they are used. And again, this depends on that implementation modality. If they are being used, describe the rationale for selecting the DLI, the amount associated with the DLI, the definition of the indicator, and the data sources that will be used for tracking that indicator. And you should repeat this description for each DLI linked to this module. Now, we know that DLIs might be relevant for multiple modules. And if this is the case for you, please identify the module where the DLI has the most relevance, and for this module, include the full amount requested, the rationale, etc. And then wherever else this DLI occurs, just write the name of the DLI. Just list it. You don't have to repeat the rest of the content each time that this DLI occurs. And then with all of the DLIs listed for this module, once per module, the box should also have a description of how the applicants will ensure the quality of the data being reported. So again, this is not at a DLI level. This is being requested at that modular level. Finally, next, we have the blue box on sustainability and transition. And this part relates to the modular level again, where the applicants need to consider the sustainability of the investments and how the investments will be programmatically sustained following transition. All applicants should align this section with the funding landscape table and the transition work plan if available or required for that application approach. Let's go to the next slide. This is matching funds. So if your allocation letter designated matching funds, describe how they have been incorporated into the funding request and how the conditions are met. Detailed guidance on the matching funds will follow. We had an information session on allocations and matching funds on March 25th, and this is already available to watch and to look at the slides on the Global Funds website. So I will ask my colleagues to share the link in the chat so you can already go and access the slides and watch the session, as well as some of the other information sessions that we have already had for Grant Cycle 8. Let's go to the next slide. Section 2 is on domestic financing, co-financing, and transition. This section focuses on progressive financing and preparing for effective transitions, looking at domestic financing, co-financing, transition planning. The sustainability transition and co-financing guidance note is being updated and will be shared soon and will be very necessary for this section. Go to the next slide. Financing the responses. This is on question 2.1A and B. And applicants are asked to report progress on co-financing in Grant Cycle 7, to present expected trends in Grant Cycle 8, and to describe the specific commitments that are going to be formalized in the commitment letter. And responses to these questions should be consistent with the funding landscape tables. Aligning on the co-financing commitments is always important, so we're recommending as a good practice that these conversations begin early to make sure that the commitments are really setting up countries well for an eventual effective transition. As a note, commitment letters are required before grants can be signed for the full allocation amount. This is not a new expectation, but it will be more strictly enforced in GC8, with portions of the allocation that are ring-fenced until the letters are received. Let's go to the next slide. 2.2A is on transition planning and challenges. With so much of the strategic shifts focusing on delivering effective transition to full domestic financing for health, this question is quite important. It asks applicants to discuss transition plans, challenges, and gaps. Question elements in this section, again, the elements are the section within the instructions, these might overlap with what is requested in the transition work plan. Now, guidance for the transition work plan is still being developed and will be included in the sustainability transition and co-financing guidance note. And if there is overlap between the transition work plan and this question, there is no need to repeat the information. Just include in the narrative response that the question element is covered on X page or on X section of the transition work plan and move forward. And as mentioned in last week's strategic shift session, it's really important for transitioning countries to plan backwards and to show at a high level how programming will be taken up by domestic financing. So if that isn't included in the transition work plan, it does need to be detailed here. Now, this question might sound a bit similar to what was included in question 1.1b on those prioritization tables, but the prioritization tables are asking for transition information at the level of the module, and the modules that are included in the request for financing to the Global Fund. This question is asking for a much higher level discussion of transition planning and may include discussions of programming not included in the funding request, for example, in the PAR, or things that have been previously funded by the Global Fund or by other donors. So if there are gaps in financing of the health sector, and specifically these programs, plans to bridge the gaps should be discussed in this section. Let's go to the next slide. Section 3 is on implementation. This last section covers how grants will be implemented, and it includes details on implementation arrangements. Next, in this question, 3.1a, applicants are asked to describe changes from Grant Cycle 7 to maximize effectiveness and value for money. And this is where some of that focus on the strategic shifts we mentioned earlier of simplifying implementation arrangements and focusing on value for money, where these can be demonstrated. This question is also important for showing increasing self-reliance and programmatic sustainability. Where local entities are not already principal recipients, applicants should show how capacity will be transferred to them. In this section, applicants should consider how to better include community-based and community-led organizations, removing barriers to roles in the implementation arrangements. And the session last week on the strategic shifts had a good discussion on this topic. And of course, I refer you to the forthcoming Sustainability Transition and Co-Financing Guidance Note for more information, especially on value for money. So this concludes the different questions in the funding request application forms. Let's go to the next slide and we can look at the application package. So these are the different annexes and attachments which are included and required for the Tailored for Focused and the Tailored for Transition application approaches. And if you were around in Grant Cycle 7, or if you attended the information session for core and high impact applicants, I'm sure you can already appreciate the far fewer annexes that are being asked for focused portfolios in Grant Cycle 8. To roughly categorize these annexes, on the furthest left row are the annexes that detail what is requested to be funded and what the goals will be. Next row to the right, we have the plans and assessments which informed the request. Third row, we have documents which provide more information on how the programs are funded and will be funded, as well as the priorities for what would be funded if financing became available. Fourth row, finally, we have documentation needed to ensure that global fund requirements are met, such as those related to country dialogue or co-financing. And we already walked through these annexes, covering what they are for during our Applying as Core and High Impact Portfolios using the full review information session, which we hosted back in January. The slides for this session and links to the recordings are, which are on YouTube, are available on the information sessions page of the Global Fund website. And I'll ask my colleagues to share the link in the chat again so that you can all have access to these slides and recordings. That being said, we do have some differentiation in these annexes for focused portfolios that I would like to highlight today. The performance framework uses the same Excel format for focused portfolios as the core and high impact portfolios do, but the amount of information requested for focused portfolios is significantly less. For example, focused portfolios are not asked to include impact or outcome indicators, and the amount of coverage indicators requested is much less and is different depending on which management model is used. Considering these differences, we highly recommend consulting the Performance Framework Development Guidelines, which will be published soon, before starting to work on the Performance Framework. The budget is even more highly differentiated, with different information requirements depending on management module and whether applicants are submitting classic or grant-ready funding requests. And applicants using the aligned management model aren't even asked to submit a budget request. They just list the total budget per module in the application form. Now, this isn't the right time to get into the details on all of the different options, but I'm sharing this just to highlight that the requirements really are a lot less for focused portfolios than for core and high impact, or from what focused portfolios used to have in the past. And so please, before starting on these annexes, please carefully look through the budgeting guidelines once they are released, so you don't have to do a work on the budget that you didn't have to. The other annex, which is quite different for focused portfolios, is the funding landscape table. This document should be shortly available on the Global Fund website, and you'll see that there are two versions, one for core high impact and one for focused portfolios. And the version for focused portfolios is already quite a bit lighter than for core high impact. But again, it is important to look at the instructions tab carefully for the focused funding landscape table, because focused applicants are only asked to include an aggregate of past spending on the diseases, and all of the other sections in that annex are optional. So please just, again, look at the instructions carefully to see how it might be different for focused portfolios, because the amount that we're asking for is different and most likely less than what you have been used to providing for focused portfolios in the past. And you should be familiar with the other required annexes, but please just note that the transition work plan is required for Tailored for Transition and is, if available, for Tailored for Focused. Again, the guidance on developing these work plans will be part of the Sustainability Transition and Co-Financing Guidance Note, which should be published soon. So with all that, let's go back to Lindsay, who will take us through the rest of the presentation.
Thanks so much, David. Okay, so now we've gone through the whole picture of if you are a Tailored for Transition or Tailored for Focused applicant, what do you need to develop in terms of the funding request form, the questions that you need to answer, which annexes are required. And now you need to think about, okay, so when am I going to do this? And I think the answer to that question is, well, if you know already that you need to develop your funding request or your funding application in 2026, you need to aim for window 1 and 2. We talked about that already. And you need to think about, am I classic or am I grant ready? Because that will affect how you think about managing the rest of the months of this year. So for example, if you are preparing for a classic funding request and you're planning for window 1, you will have more time for the grant making on the other side. Whereas if you are aiming for window 2, you might want to consider grant ready being a good option if that's something that's appropriate for your context, because then you will have less time to complete grant making on the other side of window 2. So these are just planning considerations as you think about the role of the CCM, the role of the PR, and how you want to use the months that are ahead in 2026. Okay, so now after we covered the funding requests, now we're going to cover the CCM investment portfolios pilot. Now, the idea of the CCM investment portfolios pilot is that it is one that we will learn with together. The Global Fund is proposing this for the first time in Grant Cycle 8 so that we can build on the experience and adapt and improve as we go. This is the idea of actually significantly cutting work out of the applying for funding stage, balancing that with the appropriate risk of the amount of funding that is involved and the stage of transition of these particular portfolios. So for Grant Cycle 8, 10 portfolios have been identified to pilot this submission approach, which is that the applicant considers the input from the allocation letter, receives some input from the TRP in advance as pre-shaping, and then the applicant, the CCM, develops a 2-page confirmation of funding priorities following their dialogue they're engaging in country, which they use to brief the country team, the Global Fund country team, and the principal recipient. So there's no funding request, there's no funding request review. It is the CCM that is documenting their investment priorities, which they then brief PR and the CT with, so that the grant negotiation can then be engaged in. And then the final submission is actually made by the principal recipient through the partner portal. If these pilot countries want to propose that they develop a funding request and go through TRP review instead, if they meet certain criteria, they can discuss that with their country team to opt out of this approach. But we would really encourage those 10 that have been identified for this CCM investment priorities pilot to experience this with us over Grant Cycle 8 so that we can learn together. Next slide. Just as a recap, the TRP will provide pre-shaping for the portfolios that would need to develop their CCM investment priorities approach in 2026. That should happen in the next month. Then the CCM engages in their country dialogue. They document their priorities. They brief the CT and the PR, who would then go off and negotiate those grant documents. The CCM then has the opportunity to review the grant documents. And if they endorse them, then the PR submits the package to the Global Fund through the partner portal, and it would go through the GAC review with the TRP as a technical partner member of the Grant Approvals Committee. Next slide. The application package that would need to be pulled together at the end of this process would have some input from the CCM and some input from the principal recipient. The CCM would be responsible for then that 2-page documentation of their investment priorities, the CCM endorsement, statement of compliance that they've engaged in that inclusive dialogue, and that they have included the focus of funding in their investment priorities as required. The evidence of co-financing commitments from GC7 would still be required. The co-financing commitment letter still required, but fewer annexes here. The performance framework and the budget for the grant or grants would be developed by the principal recipient. The focused funding landscape table would go along with it. And if there's an existing transition work plan, we would suggest including that as well if available. So that can be reviewed by the Grant Approvals Committee as an entirety. So this would be the submission package for this CCM investment priorities request application approach. Next slide. And in terms of timing, that TRP input for pre-shaping, as I said, will happen shortly. And then the CCM dialogue can continue. And then at some point when the investment priorities are ready, they could be briefed to the PR and to the CT then for having a more extended grant negotiation period. They would be able to register for any GAC meeting, but this is not required to be submitted in one of the funding request submission windows because it's not a funding request and it doesn't go through TRP review. Next slide. So a few resources and then a recap of next steps, and then we'll turn it over to questions and answers. The information sessions have already been highlighted in the chat so that you have the link to those. You can go back to previous information sessions to watch the recording, to look at the slide decks that are available in English, French, Spanish. And then we have an upcoming session in April on more detailed walkthrough of how to submit your funding request through the partner portal. Next slide. There are some resources that are already available on the Global Fund website, and more resources will be increasingly added to the Global Fund website over the next couple of weeks. So please do continue going back and reviewing that because the investment guidance will be published as well as all the remaining annexes for the funding request application. Next slide. So the immediate next steps, just as a recap, we've discussed all these things, but just to make sure that you have them front and center, already in March, still in March, the update to the grant entity data needs to be something that the CCM admin focal point is looking at. The CCM should be planning their meetings to be able to discuss the implementation arrangements, nominating their PR, thinking about program split, deciding on a submission pathway, which submission window to come to, and then attending upcoming workshops as they are available. We are asking that you document some of these decisions in that form that was mentioned earlier so that we can create the funding request and share the documents in the partner portal. After they're nominated, principal recipients should also be looking to update their grant entity data, adding the appropriate editors and submitters for the online performance framework. And then if they are requested to develop a performance framework and budget for the grant-ready funding request submission pathway, starting work on that, making sure that you're in close consultation with your CCM so that the actual grant document is aligned to the priorities that are documented in the application form. Okay, next slide. We are into the Q&A session, and I have not been keeping track of the questions, but I have a team that has been working in the background to add the questions into the slides that are coming up. And if there are already articulated answers, they will also be on the slide. And if they don't have answers, then I will attempt to give you some answers, or I will call on some of my wonderful colleagues who are online who can give you more precise answers for specific topical areas. Okay. First question. If we have chosen the grant-ready submission pathway, meaning that we have reappointed an existing PR to continue in grant cycle 8, does this go automatically with the subrecipients? So I see that there's a response here that I'll read out and then I'll add some additional thoughts myself. So there is no requirement that the subrecipients are new or continuing as part of the grant-ready funding request decision. Subrecipients may be confirmed later, while the grant-ready process requires principal recipients to be confirmed before the funding request can be developed. Of course, it's encouraged to confirm all implementers as early as possible, to involve them as appropriate in planning to increase the chance of implementation readiness. All this is true, and I also think something that is important that is alluded to in the question is whether or not, if an existing principal recipient is chosen by the CCM, nominated for Grant Cycle 8, does this mean that automatically all the subrecipients that worked with that PR in Grant Cycle 7 would also continue? The answer to that is no. And I think the important consideration for the CCM and the principal recipients at this stage is that we, as the Global Fund community, need to streamline our implementation arrangements more broadly, not just at the PR level, but also at the SR level. This is a key opportunity for us to reduce management costs, to drive efficiency, to be able to bring to life integration. And so looking at the whole implementation arrangements is an important consideration upfront. So just because you have been implementing a Global Fund grant as a PR or a subrecipient in the previous cycle, it's not a guarantee that that would happen again in Grant Cycle 8, because we do need to think about streamlining implementation arrangements across the board. Question 2, for grant ready submission, is the requirement only the same PR? How about SRs? Is there a required process to select SRs? Well, we've somewhat already discussed this in the first question. So the requirement is that all principal recipients who will implement grants in Grant Cycle 8 for that component also implemented grants in Grant Cycle 7. So it is possible that if there is grant consolidation, as long as that it's an existing principal recipient that has been implementing a Global Fund grant, that they can continue, then they are still eligible for the grant ready submission pathway. There's no requirement for there to be continuing SRs as part of the grant ready funding request. The process and timing for selecting SRs doesn't change. Obviously, we would encourage confirming implementation arrangements as early as possible to improve the chances of implementation readiness. Question 3, we are a youth-led organization. We are already started coordination with the CCM. Our questions are, can we directly apply as a PR? How to collaborate with the existing PRs to engage as a SR or SSR? We're wondering if the existing PRs already has subrecipient partners. Okay, so these are all great steps to take to be, first of all, interested in supporting the Global Fund, improving its implementation and its execution of the grants. Thank you for that interest. It is absolutely the right thing to do to be engaging with the country coordinating mechanism. The country coordinating mechanism in most portfolios has the responsibility to identify and nominate the principal recipients. So it's not possible to apply directly as a principal recipient to the Global Fund. You would need to be nominated by the CCM in your country. But it is also through the CCM that you would be able to connect with the principal recipients that are nominated, if you're interested in continuing to explore this, to see whether or not you would bring added value as a subrecipient or a sub-subrecipient in the overall implementation arrangements. So please do continue to reach out to the CCM to request this information because they are able to share information about implementation arrangements with you so that you can consider how you can present yourself as an addition and a value add to the implementation arrangements. Next slide. Which forms should be used for multi-component application that includes one component to be transitioned to in GC8 and the other in GC9? Okay, so if you are a focused portfolio, which this session is for focused portfolios, if you are a focused portfolio and you have one component or more that is designated as having a final allocation for Grant Cycle 8, you are requested to use the Tailored for Transition funding request for all of your components. And so that is the application approach that we would expect that a focused portfolio would use if at least one component is receiving a final allocation in Grant Cycle 8. We do encourage the multi-component funding request submission, so one funding request for all components. But if that's not possible, then at least it is required that all funding requests are submitted in the same submission window. Question 2. When will the list of countries for which Grant Cycle 8 is the final allocation cycle and those for which Grant Cycle 9 is a final cycle be published? Okay, so great question. We are close to being able to publish that information. We have an important reporting step with our strategy committee and our board, and that is going to be completed in the next week. And after that reporting to our strategy committee and our board is completed, then we will be able to publish a list of the components and the countries to which a transition timeline has been confirmed. Question 3. Will the PR be one for the chosen portfolio? Okay, so I think actually I'm going to answer this a little bit different. I think what the question is asking is it required that a portfolio has only one principal recipient? And I think what's important to understand here is that with the Global Fund's emphasis on streamlining implementation arrangements for Grant Cycle 8, in many countries, we are encouraging the CCM to select one principal recipient to manage one grant or to manage more than one grant. But by streamlining those implementation arrangements, we'll be able to deliver impact with more efficiency, value for money, and sustainability. So it's not mandatory that all portfolios evolve to having one principal recipient only, but it is the direction we're going in many portfolios for Grant Cycle 8. Question 4 on this slide. Will the PR be the only one to facilitate grant implementation? Okay, and the answer here is principal recipients are responsible for implementing grants, along with subrecipients and other implementers as defined in the grant under the oversight of the CCM. So indeed, the grant implementation is a responsibility of the principal recipient for the scope of the grant that is agreed. And so a grant is agreed between a principal recipient and the Global Fund. Those are, that's a contract. And it is the principal recipient with the oversight of the CCM that identifies the appropriate cascading implementation arrangements for subrecipients and sub-subrecipients as necessary to be able to fully deliver on the scope of the grant. But it is the PR's responsibility to ensure that implementation. Next slide. How about those countries that are not eligible in CCM? Who's responsible for the process? Is it the government or Ministry of Health? I'm not sure exactly what the question means. If a country is not eligible for Global Fund financing, then it does not receive an allocation. If the question relates to CCM eligibility requirements, there are 6 CCM eligibility requirements. 2 of those are assessed when the funding application is submitted, and the Global Fund will not review the funding request until a CCM has demonstrated compliance with the eligibility requirements. Question 2. What are the countries that have been chosen for CCM investment priorities, and what have been the criteria for choosing them? Okay, so after the board reporting and after we publish the transition timings, we will then be publishing the list of countries and application approaches. And in that list, you will see the countries that have been identified for the CCM investment priorities application approach to pilot it in Grant Cycle 8. In total, there are 10 focused portfolios. And essentially, it was a process of default. The board decision in 2025 indicated that the overall approach for focused portfolios should be more differentiated and balanced in terms of the Global Fund's risk approach. And on balance, the TRP shouldn't be reviewing all the focused portfolios funding requests that we would learn from this experience, but that the TRP should review all transition funding requests. Well, since the majority of focused portfolios are actually developing a transition funding request for Grant Cycle 8, those will be automatically reviewed by the TRP. And then of those that do not require a transition funding request in Grant Cycle 8, 4 have been identified to develop a funding request and go through TRP review. Those are the tailored for focused applicants. And then the remainder are the 10 that do not have a component transitioning in Grant Cycle 8. And so it's those that we would like to pilot this approach with in Grant Cycle 8. And as I've said previously, we will learn from the pilot and adapt as we go to optimize the output. Question 3, if the allocation letter is already sent and has HIV, TB, and malaria, is it possible to add AMR in the grant application? I must admit, I don't know what AMR is. So are there any grant management colleagues who understand that acronym and would be able to come on to screen to respond to this question? Hi, Bruno.
I can antibiotic multi-resistance, and I don't know if it's included or not in the eligibility criteria. So it's a half an answer. Sorry.
Okay, half an answer is better than my no answer. Thanks, Bruno. So when the modular framework is published, then you will be able to find out whether or not that is eligible for Global Fund financing and could be included in the funding application. Next question, number 4. Is it possible to apply in one of the windows to be determined in early 2027 for the implementation period 2028 to 30? Yes. And is it possible to nominate an NGO as PR and in advance recognize other NGOs as subrecipients, or is it necessary to have an open call on selection of subrecipients by the PR? Okay, so lots of sub-questions in there. Certainly an NGO can be selected as a principal recipient by the CCM. So that is a CCM responsibility. And in terms of the selection of subrecipients or whether or not how that process is run, that I am not an expert in. So I can't provide you an answer to that. Bruno, do you want to come back on screen? Are there guidelines on the how the selection of subrecipients is required to happen?
So it's a responsibility of the principal recipient to select the subrecipient. Usually it's go according to the principal recipient guideline. So it can be a procurement, can be based on previous performance. So it's very country-led. After there is some specificity when a SR is doing very specific activity and it's the only one, there are some exceptions that are granted here. But it's in very short, it's a principal recipient responsibility to select the SR.
Thank you. Okay, question 5. If a CCM does not need a program split change, we only have to inform that we agree or that we accept. This is how we understand it. Is it right? Yes, you've understood that. So for focused portfolios, if you agree with the proposed disease split, you can inform your CT that you accept the proposed disease split and you do not need to complete the form. The form is only required if you are requesting a change. So now, question 6, for the program split, in the absence of CCM, who has the authority to take the lead? In the context of our country, where there is no CCM and the Ministry of Public Health is considered the de facto authority. Okay, so in all countries, the Global Fund has a partner organization. And there are some countries where we have the non-CCM status, but there is still an operational body that the Global Fund engages with. So in this particular context, I don't know which country this relates to, but there is always going to be the ability for you to contact the fund portfolio manager for your specific country to ask the question about who is on this responsible body if there is a non-CCM situation. you can find out the name of that fund portfolio manager that is responsible for your portfolio on the Data Explorer site. You can search for the country and you'll be able to access the name of and the contact email of the relevant fund portfolio manager from the Global Fund. Number 7, is there a limit on how much the program split can be changed? What is the average change? Interesting question. So it depends on the grant cycle. We've seen a great variety of small changes to substantively larger changes in different funding cycles. But overall, the amount of change average is less and less. In the last funding cycle, for example, there were, I think, 75% of countries made no change at all. So there were only changes in about a quarter of the portfolios, and the average change was less than 10%. It's a small-ish number in comparison to the large amount of funding that the Global Fund operates with. So there is no limit on how much the program split can be changed, yet the Global Fund has very specifically agreed the indicative disease split for each country within the total funding available. And so if a CCM is proposing a change to program split, it would need to be well justified. And if it would mean that there would be a reduction in the ability of the program to be able to continue delivering essential services as a result of that program split change, then it would go through an elevated review within the Global Fund. Additionally, there is also a percentage and funding amount above which a mandatory elevated review would happen. But that mandatory elevated review doesn't necessarily mean that the Global Fund would disagree with the change. It's just that we would need to ensure that we had appropriate management approval for a more substantive change. Okay, I think we can go on to the next slide. Given the substantial effort required from CCMs to prioritize activities, there is an increasing need to confirm that these dialogues are indeed taking place and the right stakeholders are represented. How do you envision leveraging the LFA in supporting this role? So as of now, the LFA has not often been used to verify that the dialogue that the CCM confirms has taken place has actually taken place. There is a different process in place for the Global Fund to screen for eligibility requirement number 1. And if there are flags, then we pursue that with a different level of scrutiny. But that's not a role that we have used the LFA for in the past. And I don't anticipate that that will be a significant role for the LFA going forward. Question 2, can a country have 2 PRs? Can a country have only 1 PR from a civil society organization? So the answer to this question is yes, a country could have more than 1 PRs. Some larger portfolios with larger allocations have several principal recipients. For smaller allocations, the Global Fund certainly is advising that we streamline implementation arrangements. You've heard me say this many times in this info session. And it's possible that a civil society organization could be a single principal recipient for a portfolio. It's important, though, that the discussion between the CCM and the Global Fund on the selection of the PR also discusses sustainability and how that civil society organization would be able to have a role in sustaining the program delivery post-transition is an important discussion as well. Question 3, do we require 2 or 3 PRs in Grant Cycle 8 for accountability and transparency, as the majority of government agencies are putting pressure on CCM to implement all 3 components? So the selection of principal recipients is the responsibility of the CCM in consultation with the Global Fund. And the idea of accountability and transparency is important in all Global Fund operations. But I'm not sure what the connection is with implementing all 3 components. I would just emphasize again that the Global Fund's recommendation to many portfolios in the allocation letter was to explore how to further streamline implementation arrangements as opposed to having multiple principal recipients. Question 4, what are the submission windows for 2027? So 2027 will have 2 or 3 submission windows, as we have often had in the past in the second year of a funding cycle. Those dates have not yet been set. We will set the dates for those submission windows in the second half of this year. So right now we're focused on window 1 and window 2 for 2026, but we will be communicating that, and that will go onto the Global Fund website as soon as those are confirmed. Next question, if the CCM chooses window 1 and fails to submit, does it mean it directly qualifies for window 2? If not, what should be done? Okay, yes. So if a CCM is aiming to prepare their funding request for window 1 and they're close, but it's not quite ready yet, there is the option to defer the submission to window 2. And so that could be done in a quite straightforward manner by having a discussion with the country team, the fund portfolio manager, and then they can be re-registered for window 2. It gets more tricky if a CCM is aiming for window 2 and then doesn't make it if they have a grant that's going to be ending by the end of 2026, because then it's very likely that they would need to do the work to develop a extension to ensure that there is no disruption of services. But this is something that I would encourage you to think through carefully in terms of how you plan your time to be able to accommodate the need to submit in window 1 or window 2 if you have a grant that's ending at the end of this year. Question 6, is there a specific document to inform the Global Fund about the PR designated by the country coordinating mechanism? Or perhaps an email is sufficient? So let me answer this first. There is a form that has been shared. It went out in an email that came out from the Global Fund, and it is also available on the Global Fund website to inform the PR once the principal recipient has been officially nominated by the CCM. So I'm sure my colleagues can put that the link to that form in the chat so that you're able to access that now. And then second part of the question, regarding the CCMs who have already identified their principal recipient, is there a document to use to inform the principal recipient to begin preparing the performance framework and the budget? Okay, so if a CCM has decided that they want to use the grant ready funding request and they have nominated their PR, they do need to inform the Global Fund, and we've asked that that form is completed to do that. And then the CCM would also need to ask the principal recipient to then develop the performance framework and budget. The principal recipient would get access to that performance, that grant level, performance framework and budget template through the partner portal. So the CCM would then need to log into the grant making module in the partner portal to get the access to that performance framework and budget template. Question 7, how does the Global Fund envisage the LFA supporting countries to strengthen the prioritization process, especially where resource gaps are large and trade-offs are required? So this is a key responsibility of the CCM to, through their country dialogue, identify the prioritization, leveraging data, evidence from the country, results from previous grants, etc. The LFA does not have a key role in this. So the Global Fund does not have a proposal on how the LFA would be involved in strengthening the prioritization process. If I have misspoken, I would invite any of my grant management colleagues to contribute to this answer. But as far as I know, this is not a key expectation for the LFA. The next question also relates to LFA. As you can tell, I'm not an expert. What guidance should LFAs follow when verifying alignment between the funding request, NSP, and national priorities, particularly when they differ? I'm not able to answer this, not being an LFA expert. I'm not sure of the LFA's role in verifying alignment between the funding request, the NSP, and national priorities. Does anyone else from the Global Fund want to comment on this, especially for focused portfolios? Bruno, I see you're on screen again.
Yeah. So there is no specific guidance for this. That will be at the discretion of the city, and depending on which point they would like the LFA to verify. In the same way, the role and the scope of the LFA will be adapted in each model, where there will be the greatest changes for the aligned model, where city will focus on the risks they identified and request the LFA to verify the specific things. Answering question 7 at the same time.
Thanks so much. Okay, stay on screen, Bruno. I think that some of the upcoming questions also I'm going to pass to you. Could we move on to the next slide, please? I see we've got 10 minutes left, so we'll do our best here. I've already answered the question about the multi-component application, so we'll move down to the next one, which is, Bruno, for you, what is the criteria for aligned, targeted, or light, and who decides which modality?
So it has been a Global Fund decision to for the different modalities. The country with an allocation lower than 10 million has been moved to the aligned model, who is a simplest model. So I know that it's a change, but just for everybody to keep in mind, it's a model with the lowest requirement and the simplest model. So that means we will ask less to those portfolio. For the light model, it has been kept for country with an external risk index which is very high, COE, or country under ISP, or country under sanction. I will repeat what we put in the answer. It's each portfolio has been assigned a model, and we strongly recommend not to mix model because it will make your life more complicated.
Which we want to avoid.
Too. So it's better if everybody stick with what has been decided. We will provide additional guidance on the different model to the country teams, the CCM, and to the PR if needed.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I think this is also about the management models. And I think Bruno has also explained in the last answer that the more guidance will be shared specifically through the CT that can be then explained to the CCM and the principal recipient if needed about the relevant model. So we don't need everyone to understand all the models. What you need to understand is the significance and the importance of the model that's relevant for your portfolio. So we will do some follow-up communication on that after these info sessions are done. Next slide, please. What is the deadline for GED updates? And are there any sessions for that? Okay, so GED should be updated as early as possible. It obviously depends on how soon you need to develop your funding request. But if you need to develop a funding request in 2026, you need to do the GED updates tout de suite, right away. So CCMs will use the Global Fund Partner Portal to access and eventually submit the funding request application package, and that will start in a couple of weeks. So the admin focal points have already been given the submitter access. The CCM is responsible for confirming that the right admin focal point information is in GED, and then for creating or updating any other contacts who need to be having access to the portal. We will be sharing this guidance really soon, and there'll be an info session for how to submit your funding request through the partner portal and the classic or the grant ready route on the 8th of April, and that will be for CCMs. Question 2 on this slide, our grant ends December 2027. Do you recommend the April 2027 window? So we have not set the windows yet for 2027. So when those are confirmed, then you can confirm which is the appropriate window, but you should aim for one in the first half of 2027. Regarding the CCMs who have already identified their principal recipient, I think we've already answered this question. is there a document to inform the PR to begin preparing. The grant ready, if the grant ready route is selected, the principal recipient will receive the documentation to complete through the partner portal. Question 4, I want to know if after submitting the report, we can still ask questions since we don't have a stable internet connection. I'm not sure what the question means about which report, but if you would like to ask follow-up questions after this information session is done, you can always contact the Fund Portfolio Manager, a member of the country team, for the country that you are responsible for. And the information on this session, both the recording and the slides, are available on the Global Fund intranet so that you're able to download those and rewatch or be able to look at the slides when you have a more stable connection. Next slide, please. Kindly share guidance on the respective roles and responsibilities of the CCMs and principal recipients throughout the funding request development process to ensure clarity and avoid unnecessary overlaps. Totally get it. You know, we are introducing a new opportunity to engage with the PR earlier, and it's important that we don't duplicate, but we optimize who's doing what and when. So the updated operational policy note and procedures will detail all the roles, responsibilities, and requirements for the funding request and grant making process. That is almost final, and you'll be informed when it's published on the Global Fund website that will be shared through an email update. For newly appointed principal recipients, will a capacity assessment be requested? The answer is yes. The capacity assessment is required for new principal recipients or for principal recipients implementing new activities. Next question. For a CCM that will only complete the selection process of the principal recipients by June 2026, will it be feasible to carry out the selection of new civil society principal recipients in time for the second submission window? Okay, so the selection of principal recipients is important to do as early as you can, especially if you want to use the grant ready submission pathway. If you are planning on using the classic funding request submission pathway, the nomination of the principal recipient normally happens by the time that the funding request is submitted, and that is submitted on, for window 2, the 27th of July. If you want to do the grant ready submission pathway, and you only will be able to nominate your principal recipients by the end of June, that will be too late to do the grant ready submission pathway for window 2. Next question. Will the Global Fund review funding requests that are not integrated funding requests? Okay, great question. Maybe I wasn't clear on this in the presentation. The Global Fund encourages all applicants to develop a multi-component integrated funding request and submit it as one package. However, the Global Fund requires that all funding requests from one country are submitted at the same time. So we encourage you to develop that multi-component funding request. If it's not possible, then you need to develop parallel funding requests, but submit them in the same review window so that the TRP is able to review those to have a complete holistic picture of the proposed programming for the country. So I think this may be our last question since we are at time. Is the selection of principal recipients required to go through a new call for proposals if the country considers it appropriate to continue with the current PRs, especially given time constraints? Additionally, is there a maximum number of subrecipients that should not be exceeded? So the answer is the Global Fund does not require the CCM to publish a call for proposals if the CCM chooses to renominate a well-performing existing principal recipient. More detailed guidance on the PR nomination process will be shared shortly.
Hi, Lindsay.
Hi.
We have, looking through the rest of the questions, we have a lot that we haven't gotten to, but there's two questions in particular that I think we should try and get before we go.
Okay.
One, can we please confirm that the programmatic gap table is not a requirement for focused and transition applicants? And two, when will the funding request tracker be available that provides more information on the different funding requests that will be submitted?
Thank you. Okay, so the answer to the question about the programmatic gap table is the programmatic gap table is available, will be, it's not currently, the programmatic gap table will be available on the Global Fund website as an optional tool that a country could choose to use regardless of which portfolio you are. It is a required part of the submission for high impact and core portfolios. It is not required for focused portfolios that are developing a funding application. Not required for the tailored for transition focused, not required for the tailored for focused, not required as a submission component of the CCM investment priorities. So not required for focused portfolios, but available for you in case you would like to use it, if that would help refine your prioritization for your grant cycle 8 investments. And then the second question was about the funding request status tracker. That has been used in the past to illustrate which components are coming together in a funding request, which window are they coming to, and which application approach is being used for each of the countries or components. Again, once the board reporting is completed, which we expect to happen next week, then we will be publishing the transition timelines as a standalone document. And then we will be, following that, we will be issuing an early version of the funding request status tracker, which will then list out the country components and application approach that will be used. And then as each CCM confirms the components that are in the funding request and which window they are going to be coming to, then we will issue updates of that funding request status tracker that will then confirm which window has been confirmed by the CCM when they plan to submit their funding request or their funding application for Grant Cycle 8. So I would say that's probably 2 weeks away for the first version, and then will subsequently be updated as we get confirmations from CCMs on the plan submission timelines. Okay, so David, are those the most urgent questions for today?
Those are the most. Thank you so much.
All right, so then on behalf of a large Global Fund team who has been working in the background to prepare for this session, but also to try to equip you for Grant Cycle 8, thank you for joining us for this information session, and I wish you all the best as you think about how to most appropriately invest the funding that is available through the allocation funds that has been communicated to you through the allocation letter and will be available for your Grant Cycle 8 grants. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.